For many people today, faith is something that sits quietly in the background. It shows up during holidays, special occasions, and moments of need. But for others, faith is more than that. It is a question, a search, sometimes even a struggle. And for one man, over 700 years ago, faith was not just something he believed in. It was something he could no longer feel. His name was Peter, and his story began with a doubt that most believers are too afraid to say out loud. Peter was a Catholic priest, respected and educated. He had served in the city of Prague for many years. Every day he said Mass. He lifted the host, repeated the sacred words, and told his congregation, "This is my body." But somewhere deep inside, he was no longer sure. What if the bread and wine were just symbols? What if Christ was not really present in the Eucharist? What if he had been speaking empty words all along? This was not just a passing thought. It was a wound that kept growing. And eventually, it became so heavy that Peter could no longer bear it in silence. So he did something that would change history. He left his home, his parish, and his daily routine behind. He set out on a long and uncertain journey to Rome. He did not go for adventure or fame. He went to search for truth. He hoped that by praying at the tomb of St. Peter, the first pope, something inside him would change. As he walked across the European countryside, Peter carried more than just a bag and a walking stick. He carried a broken heart, a soul full of questions, and a desire for God to speak not through doctrine, but through something real, something he could touch. His journey brought him to a small Italian town called Bolsena. It was quiet, peaceful, and filled with stories. One of those stories was about a young girl named Christina who had stood up for her Christian faith even when it nearly cost her life. The locals told Peter about her courage, about how she had survived torture and even being thrown into a lake with a heavy stone tied around her. Instead of sinking, the stone floated. People believed it was a miracle. Her footprints were said to have been left on the very rock that kept her above water. This story moved Peter, not because it answered all his questions, but because it reminded him that sometimes faith floats when everything else says it should sink. It gave him just enough strength to take the next step. He decided to stay in Bolsena a little longer. The next morning, he prepared to celebrate Mass at the local church. He was still full of doubt. He did not feel holy or strong. He felt small. But he chose to go through with it. He spread the corporal, the special cloth used during the Eucharist. He lifted the host, repeated the words, and then something happened that no one could have predicted. The host began to bleed. Real blood, thick and dark, started to drip from the bread. It stained the cloth, the altar, and his own hands. Everyone in the church saw it. Some cried, some froze, but no one doubted what they were witnessing. It was a miracle. Peter was shocked. But more than that, he was changed. His doubt disappeared in that moment, not because someone gave him a clever explanation, but because the very thing he had doubted was now bleeding in front of him. This event became known as the miracle of Bolsena. And it is this miracle that led to the creation of the feast we now call Corpus Christi. But at the heart of it all was something very human. A man who questioned, a man who searched, a man who longed for proof that God was not far away, not hidden in clouds, but truly present in something as small and simple as a piece of bread. Even today, many believers around the world feel like Peter. They go through the motions, they repeat the words, but deep inside, they wonder if God is really there. And that is what makes this story more than just an old tale from church history. It is a reminder that faith does not always come easily, that even those who serve at the altar can struggle with belief, and that sometimes God answers not with a voice, but with something so real that it leaves stains behind. on cloth, on stone, and on the human heart. The miracle of Bolsena is not just about blood on an altar. It is about the invisible becoming visible, about heaven touching earth, about doubt turning into belief. And it is the reason why, centuries later, Catholics around the world still walk the streets on the feast of Corpus Christi, carrying the Eucharist through towns and cities, not as a symbol, but as a living presence. Long before the bleeding host in Bolsena, long before processions filled the streets, and even before the church had a name for Corpus Christi, there was a young woman living in silence, far from crowds, and carrying a secret. Her name was Juliana, and what she saw would shape the future of Catholic devotion forever. Yet for many centuries, her story remained in the shadows. Juliana lived in the city of Liège, in what we now call Belgium. She was only a teenager when something strange began happening to her. It was not a dream. It was not a voice. It was an image that appeared again and again in her prayer. She saw a bright circle, like a white disk shining with light. But it was not perfect. One part of it was dark, like a stain. At first, Juliana did not know what to make of it. She was young and humble, and she did not think God would choose someone like her to deliver a message. She continued to see the same image for years. Finally, she came to understand what it meant. The white circle, she believed, was the church. It was the faith of believers, the beauty of devotion, the presence of Christ. But the dark stain represented something missing, a celebration that had not yet been created. The church, she felt, was lacking a special feast dedicated entirely to the body of Christ in the Eucharist. Not a day of mourning like Good Friday, and not a day mixed with other meanings like Holy Thursday, but a celebration full of joy, music, and light, a feast that honored the living presence of Jesus in the bread and wine. Juliana kept this vision to herself for nearly 20 years. She lived in a convent, away from attention. She prayed, served others, and waited for the right time to speak. When she finally shared her vision, most people dismissed her. After all, she was not a bishop or a scholar. She was a woman living behind cloistered walls. But there was one person who listened carefully, a humble priest named Jacques Pantaleon. Jacques was not powerful. He did not have an important position in the church at the time. But he believed her. He was moved by her sincerity and felt that her vision might be true. He promised to remember it. Years passed. Juliana died quietly without seeing her vision come to life. But history has a way of honoring the forgotten. Jacques Pantaleon eventually rose through the ranks of the church. He became a bishop, then a cardinal, and finally, Pope Urban IV. When Peter of Prague came to him in Orvieto with the blood-stained cloth from Bolsena, Pope Urban IV did more than just listen. He remembered. He remembered the vision shared with him many years before by the young nun from Belgium. The white circle, the dark stain, the missing feast. For Pope Urban, the miracle in Bolsena was not just a sign for one man. It was a confirmation of something much larger. It was as if God had chosen two very different people, Juliana in silence and Peter in public, to carry pieces of the same message. And now it was time to bring them together. Urban IV acted quickly. He gathered trusted theologians and scholars. He asked them to study the miracle. He wanted to be sure it was real. The experts went to Bolsena, examined the altar, spoke to the witnesses, and returned with one voice. The event was authentic. It could not be explained by natural causes. The blood was real. The transformation had happened. But the Pope knew that miracles fade if they are not remembered. Stories get lost, even great ones. So he made a decision that would leave a permanent mark on Christian history. He declared a new feast, the Feast of Corpus Christi. This was more than just adding a date to the church calendar. It was the answer to Juliana's vision. The dark stain in the shining circle would now be filled with celebration. The missing joy would be restored. The Pope also knew that music and poetry could reach people's hearts even more deeply than rules and orders. So he invited the greatest minds of his time to write hymns for the new feast. The most famous of them was a man named Thomas Aquinas, who would later be recognized as one of the greatest theologians in church history. Thomas did not try to impress anyone with fancy words. He wrote with deep belief. He wrote with the soul of someone who had seen what Juliana saw and believed what Peter had experienced. His hymns still echo in churches today, nearly 800 years later. One of them, Lauda Sion, is still sung during Corpus Christi masses across the world. And it all started with a quiet vision in a small convent in Belgium. What makes Juliana's story so powerful is not just the vision itself, but the way it was ignored, nearly forgotten, and later fulfilled. It shows that God often chooses unlikely people to deliver important messages. It reminds us that sometimes the seeds of truth are planted in silence and bloom only after many years. Today, when we see the Eucharist carried through city streets, or when we kneel in adoration before the Blessed Sacrament, we are part of something much bigger than a ritual. We are living the answer to a question once asked by a young woman who wanted the church to remember that Jesus is not just a symbol. He is real, alive, and present in the Eucharist. The hidden miracle behind Corpus Christi is not only the blood that flowed from the host in Bolsena. It is also the vision of Juliana, a quiet voice that was nearly ignored. Her vision became a feast, and her faith, though hidden, helped shape one of the most beautiful celebrations in the Catholic Church. When Pope Urban IV officially established the Feast of Corpus Christi, he was not only responding to a miracle or honoring a vision. He was creating something new, something that the Church had never done before. For the first time in history, there would be a feast focused entirely on the presence of Jesus Christ in the Eucharist, celebrated with joy and not with sorrow. It would not be tied to the Last Supper or Good Friday. It would be its own day, shining with light and music and movement. But a feast on paper is not enough. It needs people, it needs action, and most of all, it needs hearts ready to celebrate. What happened after the Pope's declaration shows how faith can travel faster than any letter or law. The celebration of Corpus Christi spread like light through stained glass, touching cities, towns, and villages across Europe and eventually across the world. In the early days, Italy was the heart of this growing devotion. The town of Orvieto, where Pope Urban received the miracle cloth from Peter of Prague, became a center of pilgrimage. People came from far and wide to see the blood-stained corporal, the sacred cloth that held the Eucharist during the miracle. But even more than the relic, people came to be part of the celebration. Streets were decorated. Music filled the air. Priests carried the Blessed Sacrament in special vessels called monstrances, raised high for all to see. And slowly, the custom spread. France was one of the first countries to adopt the feast. Then, Germany followed. In Spain, the tradition grew especially strong. Cities like Toledo, Seville, and Valencia turned Corpus Christi into one of the biggest celebrations of the year. Parades included not just priests and altar servers, but dancers, musicians, and even dramatic performances telling stories from the Bible. The streets became like open-air churches, full of flowers, incense, and joy. Each country added its own customs. In some places, people created beautiful carpets made of flower petals along the roads where the procession would pass. In others, they built temporary altars on street corners, where the priest would stop and offer prayers. Children wore white clothes and threw petals as the Blessed Sacrament passed by. People knelt on sidewalks and balconies, some with tears in their eyes. But no matter the style or size, one thing remained the same. The focus was always on the Eucharist. The host, carried through the streets in a golden monstrance, became a public reminder that faith is not meant to be hidden. It is meant to be shared, seen, and celebrated. For many centuries, Corpus Christi was not just a one-day event. It was an octave, meaning it lasted for 8 days. Churches held special masses, holy hours, and community gatherings throughout the week. It was a time when even those who rarely went to church came forward to kneel in silence and wonder. In some parts of Europe, kings and queens joined the procession. Political leaders walked side by side with farmers and merchants. It was one of the few times in the year when social ranks disappeared, and everyone was united in one thing: the belief that Jesus Christ was truly present in the Eucharist. Art and architecture also played a part in the spread of this devotion. Inspired by the miracle of Bolsena and the feast it gave birth to, Pope Urban ordered the construction of the Orvieto Cathedral. This was not just any building. It was a temple built to house the miracle. Its walls were decorated with golden mosaics, marble sculptures, and paintings that told the story of the Eucharist. The cathedral became a symbol of what the Church wanted to say: the Eucharist is the heart of our faith. Other churches followed this example. Across Europe, chapels and cathedrals began to include side altars for adoration. Monstrances were crafted with great care, often in gold and silver, shaped like suns to show the radiance of Christ. Painters and sculptors created scenes of the Last Supper and the miracle of Bolsena to remind people that what they celebrated was real, not just a tradition. By the time the Council of Trent took place in the mid-16th century, the Feast of Corpus Christi had become a key part of Catholic identity. The Council, which aimed to clarify Catholic beliefs during a time of division, declared firmly that Christ is truly present in the Eucharist: body, blood, soul, and divinity. This was not just theology. It was the truth behind every Corpus Christi procession. Yet, as the feast became more popular, it also faced new challenges. Not all Christian groups accepted the idea of real presence. Some called it symbolic. Others questioned the miracles. In parts of Europe where Protestant movements gained influence, Corpus Christi processions were banned or replaced with different forms of worship. Still, in Catholic regions, the feast continued to grow. Even during times of war, persecution, or disease, many communities found creative ways to keep the tradition alive. Some held smaller processions inside churches. Others turned to prayer and adoration instead of public marches. The spirit of Corpus Christi proved stronger than any obstacle. In modern times, the celebration has taken many forms. In Rome, the Pope often leads a solemn procession through the streets, followed by thousands of faithful. In Poland, entire neighborhoods decorate their houses and sidewalks. In Germany, processions cross fields and rivers. In Spain, some cities have turned Corpus Christi into full cultural festivals, mixing faith with heritage. In cities like Cologne, Krakow, and Seville, the crowds stretch for blocks. Tourists take pictures, but locals kneel. The sacred and the social blend in a way that only this feast can create. It is not just about religion, it is about presence. The presence of Jesus in the Eucharist, yes, but also the presence of a community that believes, celebrates, and shares. What started in one small town with one miracle has become a global tradition. And even in places where it is no longer celebrated publicly, the story behind Corpus Christi still lives on. In prayers, in memories, and in the quiet moments when someone kneels before the Blessed Sacrament, believing that God is not far away. The hidden miracle is not only the blood that appeared on an altar centuries ago. It is the miracle of millions of people across generations and borders who continue to believe that bread can become more than bread, and that God can walk among us, not only in churches, but in streets, towns, and hearts. We live in a world full of noise. People are busy, always rushing. Cities are loud. Phones are always ringing. There are distractions everywhere: work, social media, entertainment. And somewhere in all this noise, it is easy to forget silence, reflection, and the simple truth that something sacred still walks among us. This is where Corpus Christi enters with quiet strength. Many people today think of religion as old-fashioned. Some see it as rules, others as stories from the past. But Corpus Christi is not about rules. It is about presence, real presence. The idea that Jesus Christ is not a figure from history, not just a teacher who lived 2,000 years ago, but someone who is still here, physically, truly, in the form of bread and wine. For a lot of people, that idea is hard to accept. How can something that looks like bread really be the body of Christ? How can something that smells like wine be his blood? These are normal questions. Even some of Jesus's earliest followers had doubts when he first said it. The Gospel of John tells us that when Jesus spoke about eating his flesh and drinking his blood, many of his disciples walked away. They could not understand it. But Jesus did not change his message to make it easier. He repeated it clearly. He said, "Unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you." He did not say it was a symbol. He did not say it was just an idea. He said it was his real body, real food, and real drink. Centuries later, people still wrestle with that same message. Science tells us to trust only what we can measure. Logic tells us to believe only what we can see. Faith asks us to believe what we cannot see, but what can still be felt in the deepest parts of our being. Corpus Christi gives believers a way to reconnect with that mystery. It brings the invisible into view. It turns a quiet belief into a public witness. When Catholics walk through the streets with the Eucharist held high, they are not just holding a sacred object. They are saying to the world, "We believe God is with us, right now, in this form." And that belief is not just for one day a year. The miracle of the Eucharist happens every single time Mass is celebrated. On ordinary days, in small chapels and large cathedrals, the same words are spoken, and the same change takes place. Bread becomes the body of Christ, wine becomes his blood, and through that change, heaven touches earth. For people who are hurting, the Eucharist offers comfort. For those who are lonely, it brings company. For those seeking direction, it becomes a light in the dark. And for those who feel nothing at all, no joy, no hope, no faith, it becomes a quiet invitation to come closer, to kneel, and just be present. Many believers around the world speak of moments during adoration when they felt peace they could not explain. Others talk about healing, forgiveness, or strength to carry burdens they thought were too heavy. These are not always dramatic stories. Sometimes they are as simple as a person walking into a church tired and walking out calm, or someone who has been away from faith for years, returning after one moment of silence before the Eucharist. What makes Corpus Christi so special is that it reminds us we do not have to chase God into the sky or climb mountains to find him. He comes to us, humbly, quietly, in something as ordinary as bread. But the feast also asks something of us. It is not just about looking and celebrating. It is about living differently. If we truly believe that Jesus is present in the Eucharist, then that belief must change how we treat others. The same Christ we adore in the monstrance is the Christ we must see in the poor, the sick, the stranger, and the brokenhearted. Corpus Christi, then, is not only about worship, it is also about action. It is a call to live in a way that reflects what we believe. To be kind when it is easier to be harsh. To forgive when holding a grudge feels safer. To love without expecting anything in return. In today's world, that kind of love is rare. We are taught to protect ourselves, to win, to always be first. But the Eucharist shows a different way. It shows the way of giving. Jesus gave himself completely. not just on the cross, but every day in the Eucharist. And he asks us to do the same, not by becoming bread, but by becoming people who give ourselves to others in love. This message is just as needed today as it was centuries ago. In times of war, injustice, and division, Corpus Christi stands as a sign of peace. In moments of doubt and despair, it speaks of hope. And in a culture that often forgets what is sacred, it reminds us that God is still close. So when we see the host lifted high in a golden monstrance walking through city streets or country roads, we are not just watching a ceremony. We are being invited into something real, something alive. A mystery that started at the Last Supper was confirmed in miracles like Bolsena and continues every time we gather at the altar. Corpus Christi may not be on every calendar. It may not be celebrated in every city, but its message is too powerful to be ignored. It tells us that love has not left the world, that truth is not an idea, but a person. And that person still walks with us, not in grand parades alone, but in simple moments, quiet prayers, and pieces of bread that carry the light of heaven. The hidden miracle is not only what happened once in Italy or Belgium. It is what keeps happening today, all over the world, wherever faith is alive and open to wonder.